Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RegameToTheCom video, we're going to be discussing and of course analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up over the past 24 or so hours. We're going to start things out with Intel because they've killed off the next generation Knights Hill Xeon Phi chips. Then we'll move over to Ryzen Mobile, specifically the HP Envy X360, which is the first laptop to go on sale, which sports AMD's new APU. We're going to discuss the architecture and specifications and other bits and pieces concerning this. Then we'll move over to a good piece of news, he says with much sarcasm indeed. Why? Because the price of silicon is going to be rising over the next 12 or so months. Isn't that spiffing? And finally, Nvidia are building a ridiculously powerful supercomputer, and we'll discuss that just for the lols, because I'm sure, yes, inevitably, we're going to want to know if it's going to run Crysis. So, in the land of Intel, a lot of stuff has happened over the past week or two. Of course, one of those is that they are now entering a weird relationship with AMD. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work in the long term, but in the short term anyway, I guess the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Frenemy? Something. Anyway, the enemy, of course, in this case is Nvidia. But one of the big things they've done, and I do wonder how much AMD pushed them to do this, or whether it was entirely his decision, and that is that they have now recruited Raja Koduri, which segues rather nicely into this question. Why have they decided to kill off the next generation Knights Hill Xeon Phi processors? So this news really started to break over this past week with the SC17 conference, which is now taking place. Of course, a lot of companies are now looking to showcase their new products and services. So, as part of the discussion with exascale computing, so that, just to define it, is a processor capable of 1000 petaflops. Intel noted that it will be abandoning the next generation Xeon Phi accelerator. That, by the way, is known as Knights Hill. Why are they doing this? Well, reasons are a little cagey, and that's putting it mildly, but too long didn't read, and I'll quote this verbatim. It is doing so in favour of a, quote, new microarchitecture and platform specifically designed for exascale. Most likely, it sounds like they are looking to really push whatever technologies Raja is going to be working on, and of course their own next generation. Now, from what we understand, the Knights Landing Xeon Phi fabric was based upon Intel's 10nm process. So, what's going to be happening and what the roadmaps are going to be what the roadmaps are going to adjust to is a bit different. Knights Mill, by the way, is slated for shipment this quarter, so I guess we'll hear more about that most likely this week. So it's going to be interesting to see how how Intel's roadmaps change. Speaking of roadmaps and Intel and AMD, let's talk about AMD's other usage for APUs, and that is their own specific ones. This one concerns the HP Envy X360. Lisa Su has managed to snag one, unsurprisingly, from Best Buy. She thanks the HP team for, quote, a great partnership. So what is this device? Well, it's, as I said, HP Envy X360, and it's a 15.6-inch convertible laptop with a 1080p edge-to-edge display, and sports a Ryzen 5 2500U quad-core SoC. That means you have 6 megabytes of total cache in the device, and while the CPU is running at a fairly nippy 3.6 GHz, it's also combined, of course, and this is perhaps the exciting thing, with Vega 8. That gives you a grand total of 512 Vega SPs, shaders, thanks to 8 compute units. Now, perhaps the really interesting thing is, despite the fact that the device is running at 1100 MHz, which is pretty damn fast, really, for the GPU, I mean, it only consumes 15 watts, it has a 15 watt TDP. Another benefit, or I wouldn't say it's a benefit, but at least it's a positive, is that the X360 does not only support 8 GB of RAM. In fact, HP are offering 16 GB, which smacks away the previous rumours. Originally, HP offered the unit with just 4+4, that's a 2400 MHz dual channel memory configuration, but those have already sold out, so now we've got devices up to an 8+8 configuration. And If you need a lot of space, well, by golly gosh, you've got up to a 1 terabyte SATA hard drive, although it doesn't appear, you can also go with a Prima HP, which has a PCIe NVMe SSD, but it doesn't appear that many users are probably going to want to opt for this type of, task anyway. I mean, let's face it, it's probably a bit much in terms of the performance, given the performance targets of the machine itself. Very quick overview of the actual chip, and we've done, quite an in-depth discussion on this in the past, but don't forget that there are a couple of different Ryzen APUs. You've got the 2500U and the 2700U. God, I can't speak suddenly. And both of which, of course, are part of the Raven Ridge architecture. And both of these will also sport Vega. The Zen cores are pretty much identical to the desktop derivatives, but obviously been tweaked a little bit more for the mobile architecture. And speaking of tweaking, the Vega graphics architecture has also had a few small changes here and there. Specifically that the high bandwidth cache controller, in other words, the actual main selling point, I guess, of the desktop, has also been replaced for a custom memory controller specifically for Raven Ridge APUs. Now, how well this performs is still, of course, somewhat of a mystery. We've had a few leaked benchmarks, but as usual, for high accuracy, we're going to have to wait until the devices have been run through the typical mill. But it does look like a fairly decent APU, and quite honestly, it's going to be very curious to see how Intel and AMD kind of coexist, but also are competing against one another at the same time in the marketplace. Very curious. Next, rumor slash tech news. This is not particularly a pleasing one to many of you, I imagine, and that is a Korean website by the name of ET News has stated that Sumco, that is SUMCO, which by the way is a silicon wafer manufacturer, a Japanese one, they, according to this website, cater for 2/3 of the world's wafer market. Now they have increased, that is Sumco, their price of silicon wafers by 20%. That is compared to this year this time versus last year this time. But that's not particularly great news, but it gets worse. So they're also looking to raise the price by an additional 20% next year, and it's going to raise even further in 2019. This is according to the CEO, who is Mr. Miyake. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. We are also planning to increase prices of silicon wafers by 20% in 2018. Prices of silicon wafers will continue to rise in 2019. Obviously this is planning to increase, but it's not a particularly happy situation, because don't forget that these silicon wafers, obviously their usages in the end vary, but like it or love it, or hate it rather, GPUs, CPUs, NAND, memory, all of this stuff actually starts life as these particular silicon wafers. And Sumco actually estimated that global shipments will go up by about 1 million units per month. So that's going to be to 6.6 million by 2020. And there are many accusations that companies such as Sumco are deliberately, purposefully holding back full volume production so that essentially prices inflate. This is not the first time we've heard companies being accused of this, and indeed we've heard of it multiple times in the memory side of things as well. Fortunately, in the memory area, there are a lot of companies which are vying to produce DRAM. So one good positive is that other companies are increasing the production capabilities, for example Samsung, to basically try and muscle in on this market, which might see the rise, which to be honest has become absolutely atrocious in the memory division. I mean, memory is just, look at the prices of RAM, DDR4 or any RAM SSDs like 2 years ago, and then compare it to now. It's very high. Like even 12 months ago it was fairly cheap, and now DDR4, you know, beforehand it was actually almost arguable that 32 gigabytes was affordable to a lot of users, you know, and future-proofing. Now, 16 gigabytes is like pretty expensive, even for not particularly fast memory, so that's definitely a problem. So hopefully as more companies jump on board and start to you know, increase their production capability, hopefully at least the shortage won't get any worse, the prices will somewhat stabilize. Finally, on a slightly lighter note, and I realise this is possibly not of interest of everyone, but it is very cool, and that is NVIDIA's supercomputer, which is known to its friend and buddies as the Saturn V. So NVIDIA are announcing it's upgrading its own computer. I guess technically the basics are already there, and it's going to be doing so with 660 NVIDIA DGX1 nodes. So this is spread over 5 rows. Now you're going to say to yourself, well, that doesn't sound too much. 660, how much is that? Well, 5,280. That, by the way, is not referencing CUDA cores. That is referencing the Tesla V100s, which make up and comprise the 5,280 GPUs. So what level of performance does that get you, I hear you ask? Well, I'm glad you did, my friend. It is 660 petaflops of FP16 performance, or, if you want me to put it into a different way, that is almost an exaflop of performance and a peak of 40 petaflops of FP64. Now, that sounds impressive, but perhaps most impressive is that, according to NVIDIA, obviously they are boasting somewhat here, they believe that Saturn V will easily, and I do mean easily, land in the top 10 AI supercomputers, not in America, but indeed worldwide. And perhaps, by the time the project's been completed and the upgrades are finished, it might even be in the top 5. Now, you might say to yourself, well, that sounds pretty impressive, but don't forget that they are not competing against other companies like, you know, AMD here and whomever else. Indeed, NVIDIA and IBM, who are also developing the Summit supercomputer, which is going to be residing at Oak Ridge National Labs, they are also competing against governments and absolutely gargantuan institutions. So this is, you know, the fact that they've actually hit the top 5, considering also how many supercomputers China have. By the way, as a slight side note, China are dominating the supercomputers. If you look at the top 100, I wouldn't say all of them or anything like that. That's way too much of a bold statement. But certainly a good number of them are now Chinese, which is something that it wasn't quite like that several years ago. But, as I said, we'll cover more about this in the future. A couple of people have also been messaging me asking what the hell is going to be going on with the next generation NVIDIA GPUs, specifically for the desktop, and honestly no one really knows at the moment in terms of the specifications or the information, which is, that of course would be Ampere, or however you're supposed to pronounce it. Now, honestly, we'll just have to wait. It looks like GDDR6 is going to be the in-memory of choice, but as for other specifications, your guess is as good as mine. How it's going to fit into the roadmaps, I don't know if it's going to be a side project or whether it's going to be like a slightly revised version of Volta, perhaps maybe with some changes which would be better for, you know, graphics, and by graphics I mean, of course, video games. But I can assume that we're not going to see HBM for the customer derivatives. I don't know. But assuming that we see a shrunk process, it might be a shrunk process. I don't know if we're going to still see 16nm for the sake of argument. But assuming we see a shrunk process, a good number of CUDA cores, perhaps some usual architecture tweaks, which obviously will improve memory bandwidth efficiency and all the other good bits and bobs that we expect from architecture improvements, I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, a fairly modest memory bus, perhaps even 256 bit, might be okay with GDDR6 with a fairly decent memory clock, if they also have better compression algorithms. But obviously this is speculation on my part, but a couple of people have messaged asking my opinions, so I thought I'd just throw them into this particular video. With all of that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. I am incredibly swamped at the moment with benchmarks. I actually finally have the Ryzen Threadripper 1950X, which is currently being benchmarked at my place. That is with 32GB of RAM and also a GTX 1080 Ti. So I'm currently fixing that, or should I finishing that. So hopefully we can have those benchmarks / reviews up over the next several days. Obviously Amy has been really busy with the Xbox One X, and she's quite enjoying it from what I've been told. Assassin's Creed Origins. She's basically, you know, pretty much ready to marry it at this point. But with that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video, and as usual, thanks for all the support and comments and all of the other bits and pieces. With all of that said, take care of yourselves. Bye for now.